Meals meant to break you. Inside America's harshest food treatment. The tray of punishment. An inmate sits in a cold, concrete cell. He hasn't tasted real food in weeks. Instead of a hot meal, guards slide through a tray holding a strange, beige-colored block. It's heavy like clay, tasteless like cardboard, and designed not to satisfy hunger but to crush the spirit. This is not food meant to nourish. This is food meant to break you. Prisons across America have used what inmates call the loaf, a mashed-up mixture of bread, vegetables, powdered milk, and whatever scraps the kitchen can find. It's baked into a dense brick, served cold, 3 times a day, with nothing else but water. Some inmates gag after the first bite. Others refuse to eat at all. Stories have spread of men losing 20 pounds in weeks, collapsing from weakness, or even smearing the loaf back onto the walls in protest. The shocking part? This meal isn't just about nutrition. It's about control. A punishment so cruel it turns food itself into a weapon. But how did something so extreme become legal inside American prisons? And why would officials feed prisoners something closer to animal feed than a human diet? To understand this, we have to step back in time. The kitchen of control. Prisons have always used food as more than just meals. Behind those walls, food equals power. If guards want obedience, they control the trays. If prisoners fight back, the first thing taken away is the comfort of food. In the 1980s and 90s, when prison violence was peaking in states like New York, Texas, and Illinois, officials looked for new ways to control chaos. Normal punishments, solitary confinement, loss of privileges, sometimes weren't enough. So, they turned to the most basic need of all, eating. The loaf was introduced as a disciplinary diet. Officials claimed it wasn't torture. They argued, it has all the nutrients a person needs. But in reality, it was dry, tasteless, and designed to strip every bit of joy from mealtime. For many prisoners, mealtime was the only break from monotony, the only moment of humanity in a day of chains and cells. Take that away, and you take away hope. At first, it was used rarely, only on the so-called worst of the worst. But soon, prisons began using it more often. A fight in the yard? Talking back to a guard? Refusing to obey orders? 3 days on loaf. And for some inmates, it didn't stop at 3 days. There are reports of prisoners being kept on the loaf diet for weeks at a time, until their bodies gave in. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. While some men struggled to survive on the loaf, others began using it in shocking, rebellious ways. The Loaf Rebellion. The first bite of the loaf is dry. By the second, it feels like chewing cement. By the third, many inmates give up entirely. But inside those cells, survival demands creativity. Some inmates began hiding their loaves under mattresses, molding them like clay, shaping them into fake chess pieces, or even using them as doorstops. The loaf wasn't food anymore. It was a symbol of punishment. Soon, word spread across blocks. Don't eat it. Refuse it. Make them stop. This quiet protest turned into something bigger. Guards began finding untouched trays stacked at cell doors. Some inmates threw the loaf back through the food slots. Others smeared it on the walls in anger, using the block like a paintbrush of defiance. One correctional officer recalled, "It was chaos. We'd slide in the tray, and the same tray came back at us, sometimes in our faces." The quiet protest exploded one summer in an Illinois prison when dozens of men on punishment diets refused to eat for days. They were weak, faint, and trembling, but they stood united. Officials panicked. If word of a mass hunger strike spread, it could trigger unrest across the facility. So, administrators doubled down. Instead of lifting the loaf punishment, they extended it. For some inmates, this was the breaking point. In the middle of a scorching afternoon, one prisoner hurled his tray at a guard. Others followed, banging on the bars, chanting for real food. The cell block transformed into a riot zone. Lockdown aftermath. The riot was quickly put down. Guards stormed the tiers with shields and batons, dragging men to solitary one by one. Blood mixed with sweat on the concrete as silence fell again. But what followed was worse than the riot itself. The prison locked down for weeks. No yard. No visits. No mail. Every prisoner, whether involved or not, felt the sting of punishment. In those weeks, men whispered about the loaf like it was poison. Some claimed it caused stomach bleeding. Others swore it was deliberately undercooked to make them sick. Medical staff quietly noted rapid weight loss and malnutrition, but speaking out meant risking their jobs. For the men inside, the message was clear: fight the loaf, and the loaf fights back harder. Yet just when the block was beginning to calm down, another extreme event hit. This time, it wasn't a riot. It was something far more chilling. One inmate was found collapsed in his cell. He had gone 5 days refusing the loaf, drinking only water. His body gave up before his spirit did. The collapse. The cell was quiet except for the slow drip of a leaking pipe. Then came the sound that spread panic through the tier. A dull thud. Guards rushed in and found an inmate sprawled on the concrete. His skin was pale, his lips cracked, and his body thin from days of refusing the loaf. He tried to hold out, tried to show strength, but his body betrayed him. Whispers spread faster than the guards could cover it up. He's down, he's not waking up, it's the loaf. Paramedics wheeled him out as other inmates watched from behind their bars. Some stared in silence. Others screamed in anger. A punishment meal, they thought, had just nearly claimed a life. The official response. Instead of ending the practice, prison officials defended it. They released statements claiming the disciplinary diet was safe and nutritionally balanced. They argued that if inmates didn't like the loaf, they could simply choose to eat it or not. To the outside world, it sounded reasonable. To those living inside, it felt like cruelty dressed in paperwork. Inmates filed grievances, writing about dizziness, stomach cramps, and starvation. Families complained, demanding answers. But officials hid behind numbers. It contains enough calories. It meets requirements. It is not torture. And still, the trays kept sliding through the slots. The silent retaliation. After the collapse, prisoners grew quieter. But silence did not mean peace. Some men began secretly hoarding the loaf, letting it rot until maggots crawled through it, then smuggling it back to guards as proof of its filth. Others took a darker path, using the hardened loaf as a weapon. In one chilling incident, a guard opening a food slot was struck in the face with a solid, dried loaf hurled like a brick. Blood spilled, alarms rang, and once again, the entire block was thrown into chaos. This was no longer just about punishment. The loaf had become fuel for rebellion. The walls began to talk. When news of the collapsing inmates spread through the block, it didn't just vanish into silence. Prison walls might look thick, but information leaks through them like smoke through cracks. Word traveled from cell to cell, whispered through vents, tapped across pipes, shouted during the brief seconds when chains of inmates crossed paths. They nearly killed him with the loaf. He went down cold. The prison administration scrambled to contain the story. Official reports framed it as an isolated health incident, carefully omitting that the man had refused to eat because the punishment diet made him sick. But inside those cells, no inmate believed that story. Every tray that slid through the slot now felt like a weapon, an intentional strike designed not to feed, but to weaken. And weakness inside prison doesn't just mean hunger. It means being vulnerable to rivals, losing respect, losing your place in the unwritten codes of survival. For men already living in cages where reputation was all they had left, the loaf wasn't just punishment, it was humiliation. Some men gave in, forcing themselves to choke it down, gagging on each dry swallow just to keep enough strength to make it through the day. Others resisted quietly, scraping bits of loaf into the toilet, letting hunger eat at them more gently than the block of punishment on the tray. But then came the louder voices, the ones who refused to suffer in silence. They began to document the cruelty in every way they could. Smuggled notes, scribbled grievances, letters to family members on the outside that read like cries for help. These notes spoke of dizziness, of stomach pains, of rapid weight loss, of men collapsing to the floor like rag dolls. And slowly, those walls began to talk louder, louder than guards, louder than wardens, louder than the official denials. The first cracks of outrage. It wasn't long before the stories reached the outside world. Families of prisoners, already suspicious of the treatment their loved ones endured, now had something specific to rally around. They wrote to newspapers, they contacted lawyers, and they raised the alarm. Our sons, our brothers, our fathers are being starved as punishment. For most of the public, prison life was a mystery hidden behind razor wire. Some people thought the loaf was justified. If they break the rules, they should eat whatever they're given. But others were horrified. Could the United States, a nation that preached human rights, really be serving meals designed to strip dignity and health away from its own citizens? Civil rights lawyers stepped in. Lawsuits began to emerge, claiming that the loaf diet violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that food was a human necessity, not a weapon, and that the loaf crossed the line into torture. But prisons fought back just as fiercely. Officials insisted, it's legal. It's balanced. It has the required calories. And for years, courts hesitated. After all, how could something so simple, a baked block of food, be torture? Inside, the reality told a different story. Men were getting weaker. Cells smelled of rotting loaf stashed away in protest. And every time a tray slid under the bars, it was a reminder that the system didn't just want their obedience, it wanted their submission. A breaking point in silence. Then came another extreme event that shattered the illusion of order. Late one night, guards patrolling the tiers noticed something off. A prisoner who had been refusing the loaf diet for days hadn't moved in hours. His body lay curled in the corner of the cell, thin, frail, barely breathing. When they opened the door, the stench of unwashed flesh and rotting loaf filled the corridor. He was alive, but just barely. His body had eaten away at itself, too weak to stand, too weak even to protest anymore. Paramedics rushed him out on a stretcher as the block watched in silence. The message was clear. The loaf didn't just punish, it destroyed. The prison locked down immediately. No yard. No mail. Lights burned bright at all hours. Guards moved with sharper cruelty, slamming food slots shut, barking orders with no patience. It was retaliation masked as order. And while the world outside debated whether the loaf was constitutional, inside, men prepared for the only kind of resistance they had left: survival, rebellion, or both. Retaliation in the dark. The lockdown dragged on. Hours felt like days and days like weeks. The hum of fluorescent lights never stopped, buzzing in the silence, reminding every man that sleep, like food, was now a privilege. Guards walked the tiers with heavy boots, their keys rattling like chains with every step. They had the power, and they wanted everyone to remember it. For the men trapped inside those cells, the retaliation was clear. This wasn't about safety anymore. This was about control. A simple punishment meal had turned into an all-out psychological war. The loaf kept coming, 3 times a day, cold and heavy. No seasoning, no texture, no taste. Just the same beige brick, morning, noon, and night. A diet designed to crush the spirit, strip away energy, and remind inmates that their hunger was in someone else's hands. Some men tried to fight back quietly. They saved bits of the loaf to feed birds that swooped into the yard when the gates briefly opened, hoping to rob the system of its cruelty. Others broke it apart, throwing chunks through the bars as if to say, "We won't take this lying down." But for many, the loaf became something darker. Their bodies shrank, cheeks hollowed, eyes lost their spark. Inmates spoke less, voices too weak to carry through the corridors. Even anger began to fade, replaced by a chilling kind of emptiness. One man wrote a smuggled letter to his sister on the outside. His handwriting was shaky, the words uneven. He said, "They call it food, but it's not food. It's punishment disguised as a meal. I don't feel human anymore." That letter never made it out. Guards intercepted it, shredding it before it could leave the prison. But other letters slipped through, each one echoing the same haunting truth. The loaf wasn't just breaking bodies. It was breaking identities. The court of public opinion. Outside the walls, whispers grew louder. Families organized meetings, community activists raised banners, and journalists began investigating what they called America's hidden meal. When the first lawsuit hit the courts, it sent shockwaves. The claim was simple but powerful: serving a punishment loaf, day after day, was cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of the Eighth Amendment. Prison officials fired back. Their lawyers stood before judges and argued, "This is not torture. It is nutrition. The loaf contains beans, flour, vegetables, eggs, and enough calories to sustain life. It is legal and it is necessary to maintain order." But then came testimony after testimony, letters from prisoners, sworn statements, medical records showing rapid weight loss and sickness. Stories of fainting, collapsing, vomiting. Men reduced to skeletons under the banner of discipline. Some judges sided with the prisons. Others questioned whether America's justice system had gone too far. The legal battle stretched on for years, with no clear end. But in the court of public opinion, the damage was already done. Headlines screamed, "Meals designed to break the human spirit." Talk shows debated whether punishment should strip people of their dignity. And ordinary Americans, many of whom had never thought twice about prison meals, suddenly wondered, what if this happened to me or someone I loved? The fire within the walls. Inside, the lawsuits didn't change the reality of daily life. The loaf still came. The hunger still burned. And the resentment boiled hotter than ever. It only took one spark. One afternoon, in a high-security block, guards slid loaves under the bars like they always did. But this time, instead of silence, the corridor erupted in sound. Metal cups slammed against doors. Voices screamed in unison. The men had had enough. When guards rushed in to control the chaos, they were met with something unexpected, chunks of hardened loaf hurled like stones, striking shields and helmets. The block turned into a battlefield, every tray of punishment transformed into ammunition. By the end of the night, dozens of men were in solitary. Guards were bloodied and bruised. The message from the prisoners was clear: you can break our bodies with this food, but you cannot break our will. But what came next would test that will in ways no one inside could have imagined. The retaliation escalates. The riot shook the prison to its core. It wasn't just about broken shields or bruised guards. It was about defiance, a message carved into the very walls. We will not be broken by your food. But in prison, defiance never goes unanswered. The retaliation was swift, harsh, and deliberate. Entire tiers were stripped of privileges. Radios, books, even mattresses were removed. Lights burned through the night, leaving men to toss and turn in endless wakefulness. And still, the loaf remained. The punishment block grew colder, more suffocating. Guards stopped speaking when they delivered trays. They slid the beige bricks through the slot and walked away without a word. Silence, in many ways, was worse than shouting. It told inmates that their suffering was routine, nothing worth noticing. For some, this was the moment they broke. Men who once stood tall now slouched against the concrete, eyes glassy, ribs sharp against skin. They ate the loaf without protest, chewing slowly, swallowing bitterness with every bite. But for others, the fire inside only burned hotter. Smuggled notes traveled across blocks. They want to starve our spirit. Don't give them that satisfaction. And so, rebellion took new forms. Men began crafting weapons from the loaf itself. When baked hard under the heat of cell lights, it turned into a rock. Guards discovered sharpened shards of loaf hidden inside cells, used to scratch walls with messages of defiance. We are still here. The loaf had become more than punishment. It was now the battleground itself. The outside spotlight. As tensions grew inside, the outside world began paying attention like never before. Journalists got their hands on smuggled photos, images of men who had lost 40 pounds in less than a month, of trays filled with dry, grayish bricks that looked more like clay than food. Television specials aired segments with headlines like, "Meals Meant to Break You," and "The Diet of Discipline." Viewers at home were horrified. This wasn't the 3 meals a day they imagined. This was a calculated tool of control. Civil rights organizations ramped up the pressure. They called press conferences, demanding that prisons end the loaf diet. They compared it to practices in war camps, arguing that America was violating its own values. But prison officials stood firm. They appeared on the same broadcasts, uniforms crisp, voices steady, repeating the same line: "The loaf is not torture." It's nutrition. It's discipline. And it works. Behind closed doors, however, even some officials admitted privately that the loaf wasn't about nutrition, it was about breaking resistance. And still, while the public debated, inside those walls, men continued to suffer in silence. The hunger strike. The spark came from one man. His name won't appear in official reports, but his act lit a fire across the block. He refused to eat. Not just the loaf, but anything. Day after day, he pushed the tray back out untouched, drinking only water. He whispered to others through the vents, "If we all refuse, they can't ignore us." And slowly, cell by cell, others joined. A handful of men turned into dozens. Entire blocks united in hunger, their stomachs gnawing, their bodies weakening, but their voices louder than ever. The guards at first mocked them, "You'll eat when you're hungry enough." But as days passed and the strike grew, the laughter faded. Men collapsed in their cells. Medical staff rushed in daily, checking pulses, recording dangerous weight loss. For the first time, the loaf's power began to turn against the system itself. What was meant to control had sparked rebellion so dangerous it threatened to unravel the prison from the inside. And just as the hunger strike reached its breaking point, an extreme event occurred, one that would force the outside world to confront what was happening. One inmate, frail and gaunt, collapsed and did not get back up. The death that couldn't be ignored. The sound of sirens echoed through the block as medics rushed in. Guards tried to cover it up, but word spread fast. A man had died on the loaf. This wasn't just another fainting spell, another collapse followed by recovery. This was irreversible. A life lost under the weight of punishment disguised as food. News traveled beyond the prison walls within hours. Families gathered outside, holding signs, demanding answers. Journalists swarmed, their cameras flashing through the gates. Lawsuits multiplied overnight. Politicians who once ignored the issue now spoke on podiums, declaring, "We must investigate." Inside, the block was silent. Not out of peace, but out of grief. Men stared at their trays, at the same beige bricks that had claimed one of their own, and wondered, who's next? The death couldn't be erased. It couldn't be spun as an incident or disguised as discipline. It was undeniable proof that meals meant to break you had gone too far. And yet, prisons didn't stop. If anything, they doubled down. Doubling down. The death should have been a turning point. For any system built on rules, accountability, and order, the loss of life tied directly to a policy should have sparked reform. But behind prison gates, reform was the last thing on the minds of those in charge. Instead, administrators held emergency meetings. They framed the hunger strike and the collapse not as signs of suffering, but as acts of rebellion. In their eyes, the problem wasn't the loaf, it was the men who refused to submit. And so, the punishment tightened. Entire blocks were ordered onto the loaf diet, not just the individuals who caused trouble. For weeks, dozens of men received nothing but the heavy beige bricks and water. Medical staff quietly raised concerns. Their bodies are wasting away. We're pushing them too far. But those voices were drowned out by the roar of discipline. One warden put it bluntly in a staff meeting, "They want to play games? We'll show them who's in control." Inside the cells, inmates felt the shift immediately. Where once the loaf was used sparingly, now it was weaponized against whole groups. Men who hadn't broken a rule in months found themselves staring at the same punishing block of food as those who had rioted. Innocence and guilt no longer mattered. All that mattered was obedience. The result was devastating. Inmates lost weight at alarming rates. Some reported hallucinations from prolonged hunger. The walls themselves seemed to close in, pressing down on men who no longer had the strength to stand tall. But when people are pushed past the point of endurance, something inside snaps. And in one cell block, that snap came in the form of an extreme act of defiance. The loaf as a weapon. It began quietly, with whispers in the dark. Men passed messages through vent shafts, tapped codes on pipes, signaling to one another like soldiers preparing for battle. If the loaf was to break them, they decided to turn it into their weapon instead. They hardened it by leaving it out for days until it dried into a rock. They sharpened the edges against concrete floors, creating crude blades. And when the time came, they acted. During a routine meal delivery, when guards slid the trays through, one inmate hurled his hardened loaf back through the slot. It struck a guard across the forehead, splitting skin, blood dripping into his eyes. Chaos erupted instantly. Other inmates joined, launching hardened chunks like stones, turning the corridor into a storm of rebellion. Guards ducked behind shields, alarms screamed through the prison, and backup swarmed the block. The rebellion was crushed quickly, as all uprisings are. Batons fell. Shackles clicked shut. Inmates were dragged to solitary, bruised, bleeding, but unbroken. For the men, it wasn't about winning. It was about sending a message. If you make food into a weapon against us, we'll use it against you too. The cracks spread nationwide. News of the uprising didn't stay contained. Other prisons began to whisper about it. Letters smuggled out described the incident in detail. They fought back with the very loaf meant to break them. Soon, hunger strikes appeared in other states. Inmates in Pennsylvania, Texas, and California began refusing trays, inspired by the defiance they had heard about. The practice of the loaf, once hidden behind bureaucratic language, was now exposed as a national controversy. Civil rights groups seized the moment. They published reports showing the world the inside reality, pictures of the dense, tasteless brick, testimonies of suffering, and medical evidence of harm. The narrative shifted from discipline to torture. Public outrage grew louder. Politicians who once ignored prison issues now faced reporters asking, "Do you support punishment meals that starve and humiliate?" The question itself was damaging enough. But inside, prisoners didn't feel the momentum of politics. They still felt the hunger. They still faced the beige block 3 times a day. And even as lawsuits piled higher, the daily reality inside the cells remained unchanged. Until one day, in one prison, things took a turn so dramatic that it forced even the hardest officials to confront what they had created. The riot of desperation. It started with a single refusal. One man shoved his tray back through the slot, untouched. Then another. Then another. Within hours, an entire block refused to eat. But this time, it wasn't just silence. It wasn't just protest. This time, it turned violent. Inmates ripped apart their cells, breaking light fixtures, tearing sheets into ropes. Fires were set in trash bins, smoke filling the corridors. Men banged on bars, chanting, their voices echoing like thunder through the prison. Guards rushed in with riot gear, shields, gas, and batons. The battle was brutal. Gas choked the air. Smoke blinded the corridors. Men coughed, gagged, collapsed. Others fought back with anything they had, broken metal, fists, and yes, hardened loaves thrown like weapons of last resort. When it was over, the block looked like a war zone. Smoke clung to the ceiling. Blood stained the concrete. The smell of burned fabric and scorched flesh lingered in the air. The message was undeniable. This wasn't just about food anymore. It was about dignity, about survival, about humanity itself. The aftermath of fire. The riot was over, but the echoes remained. Smoke-stained walls bore the scars. Shattered glass crunched under boots. And in the silence that followed, an unsettling truth hung heavy in the air. Meals meant to break prisoners had nearly broken the prison itself. Administrators scrambled. Officials in suits walked the tiers, taking notes, trying to piece together how discipline had spiraled into chaos. Reports were filed. Statements were drafted. But inside, the men still stared at their trays with hollow eyes. The loaf still came. 3 times a day. Cold, heavy, unchanging. Doctors warned of malnutrition. Nurses reported cases of fainting, dizziness, stomach bleeding. Families begged lawmakers to step in. And yet, the bureaucracy of punishment rolled forward, as though nothing had changed. Outside, however, the world was watching. Journalists showed images of the riot's aftermath on television. Protesters gathered outside prison gates with banners that read, "Food is not a weapon." Lawsuits multiplied, piling up in courts across the country. For the first time, prison officials were forced to answer tough questions before Congress. Why are American prisons serving food designed to punish, not to nourish? Some stuttered through defenses, clinging to the claim that it was safe. Others avoided the cameras altogether. The cracks were spreading. The system was no longer hidden. And the loaf, once a secret buried behind bars, was now a symbol of cruelty. The human cost. But statistics and lawsuits can never capture what it truly meant to endure those meals. The Riots story lived in the faces of the men who survived them. Men who lost 30, 40, 50 pounds in weeks. Men whose hands shook when they tried to write letters home. Men whose spirits dimmed with every tasteless bite, until silence became their only language. In interviews years later, former inmates described the loaf not just as food, but as a memory that haunted them. One said, "I still dream of it. I wake up sweating, thinking I'm back in that cell with that brick in front of me." Another said, "It wasn't about the hunger. It was about what it did to your mind." They wanted to show you that they controlled everything, even your most basic need. And perhaps that was the cruelest part. The loaf didn't just attack the body. It attacked dignity. The fight for change. Today, some states have banned the loaf. Others still defend it. Lawsuits continue to drag through the courts, each one asking the same question: where is the line between discipline and cruelty? Prison reform advocates argue that America's justice system should rise above tactics that strip humanity. They say food should never be a weapon. It should never be punishment. It should never be used to break the spirit of men who are already caged. But behind certain walls, the practice lives on. A reminder that in the shadows of the justice system, meals meant to break you still exist. The meal that spoke louder than words. So, what does it mean when a nation turns food into punishment? For some, it's just another policy buried in paperwork. For others, it's the difference between life and death. But for those who lived it, the loaf became a symbol of cruelty, of resistance, of survival against a system that tried to break them one bite at a time. And that's the truth about America's harshest food treatment. It wasn't designed to feed. It wasn't designed to nourish. It was designed to remind prisoners of one thing: that in here, every piece of your humanity can be taken away, even your right to a decent meal. The question that remains is this: if a system can break a man with something as simple as food, what else can it do? And perhaps more importantly, what does that say about us? Fade out. Black screen. The words appear in bold, stark white. Meals meant to break you,